I want you to take a second and just imagine a line drawn in the sand.
Okay.
On one side of this line is a profound, life-changing spiritual awakening. We are talking about the kind of transcendent, earth-shattering experience that, ancient prophets wrote about on parchment.
The kind of revelation that literally alters the course of human history.
Exactly. The kind that starts global movements and brings people a deep, unshakable sense of peace and purpose.
Right.
But now I want you to look at the other side of that exact same line. On the other side is a severe, acute medical emergency, a complete and utter break from shared reality.
A psychotic break.
Yeah. So here is the question we are going to be grappling with today, and it is a heavy one. How do we actually tell the difference between the two when the human brain, with all of its neurochemistry, its biases, and its desperate need for meaning, is the one drawing the line?
It is arguably one of the most complex questions in modern medicine and psychology, really, because it requires us to look at the brain not just as a biological organ, but as a meaning-making machine, one that operates within a very specific cultural context.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are opening up a massive stack of incredibly fascinating source material.
It is a really dense stack today.
It really is. We have peer-reviewed medical journals, first-hand psychiatric case reports, and deeply personal, intimate accounts that all circle around a single, highly complex phenomenon: religious delusions in psychosis and schizophrenia.
And our mission today, as we go through all of this material, is to understand how the biological brain actually processes faith.
Right. We want to know what exactly happens, both neurologically and psychologically, when that processing system just severely misfires.
And perhaps most importantly, we're going to explore how the specific culture you happen to be born into actively dictates society's perception of your sanity.
It's a huge topic.
It is. And before we get started on this, it is absolutely crucial to establish some ground rules for our journey today.
Definitely.
The sources we are going to be exploring contain intensely personal, religious, and sometimes culturally and politically charged content. We are going to be discussing various global faiths, historical events, and extremely severe psychiatric conditions.
We are covering a lot of ground.
We are. So I want to make it absolutely clear to you, the listener, that neither of us is taking a side. We are not endorsing or invalidating any religious or political viewpoints.
Right. We're not theologians.
No, we are not here to debate theology or the existence of the divine. We are acting strictly as impartial guides through this literature. Our sole purpose today is to convey and analyze the ideas, the clinical data, and the behavioral observations contained in the original medical and historical source material you've provided.
We are looking strictly at the mechanics of the human mind.
Precise.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are framing this entirely as an exploration of the human mind rather than any sort of critique of belief. And you might be asking yourself, sitting there listening right now, why should you care about this?
Why dive into something so clinical? Right.
Exactly. Why look at something so extreme? Because understanding this extreme phenomenon reveals something fundamental about every single one of us.
It really strips away the polite veneer of society.
It does. It shows us exactly how all of our brains construct meaning. It shows us how we build our day-to-day reality and just how desperate our neurology is to connect the random dots of the universe to make us feel safe.
It's a survival mechanism.
Right. And to really get inside this experience, we are going to start with a deeply personal account. I was reading through this article in Psychology Today, written by a man named Ed Ergenzinger, and my jaw was literally on the floor.
It is a remarkable piece of writing, and it's largely because of who is doing the writing.
The irony and the absolute fascination of Ed's story is his background. You read this and you think, okay, this is going to be someone who has been immersed in esoteric religious studies their whole life.
But he wasn't.
No. Ed is a highly credentialed neuroscientist. He is a patent attorney. He is an academic professor. And crucially, he notes that for most of his adult life, he has been a strict, avowed atheist.
Man of science, evidence, and law.
Exactly. Yet Ed experienced severe hyper-religiosity and massive delusions of grandeur.
Which is exactly why his case study is so vital to this literature. Because of his medical and scientific literacy, he is able to articulate the internal mechanics of a psychotic break in a way that most patients simply cannot.
He has a vocabulary for it.
He does. And one of the most striking elements of his narrative is his timeline of misdiagnosis. Ed spent nearly 20 years navigating the psychiatric system with the wrong label.
20 years.
He was treated for depression and anxiety for 2 decades.
When I read that, it completely stopped me in my tracks. How does a trained neuroscientist, someone who literally studies the brain for a living, sit in a psychiatrist's office for 20 years and get the wrong diagnosis?
It happens far more frequently than you might think, specifically with bipolar disorder.
Hmm.
And it's because of how patients report their symptoms.
Yeah, okay, walk me through that.
Well, think about it from the patient's perspective. When do you go to a doctor?
When I feel sick, when I'm in pain.
Exactly. You go when you're in pain. So patients seek help during the crushing, debilitating depressive episodes. But when they swing the other way into hypomania, which is the early, less severe stage of mania, they don't feel sick at all.
They feel
They
great.
feel fantastic. They feel like they have boundless energy, intense productivity, and incredible creativity. They might write a book in a week or start 3 businesses.
So they aren't going to complain about that.
No. They don't report that to a doctor as a symptom. They report it as a personal triumph. So the doctor only sees the depression and prescribes antidepressants.
And the reading shows that those antidepressants actually poured gasoline on the fire, right?
Precisely. In Ed's case, he was prescribed medications specifically for depression, often SSRIs or similar drugs. And when those are introduced to a bipolar brain without a mood stabilizer, they can actually accidentally spark severe acute manic episodes.
That is terrifying.
The medication essentially forcefully flips the switch from depression to severe mania. It wasn't until a particularly extreme, undeniable manic episode that he was finally given an accurate diagnosis of bipolar I disorder with psychotic features.
And what he did during that extreme episode is what makes this source material so gripping. He literally takes us inside his manic mind.
He documented everything.
He did. He knew something profound was happening, and he kept these extensive secret notebooks during his episodes. They are full of frantic thoughts, intricate ideas, and bizarre sketches.
And looking back on them, with his scientific mind, he breaks down the specific types of delusions he experienced. What's fascinating here is the precise architecture of a delusion. When we use the word delusion in everyday conversation, we usually just mean someone is mistaken about something.
Right, like, oh, you're delusional if you think that team is going to win.
Exactly. But in psychiatry, it has a rigid clinical structure. Ed's notes perfectly illustrate what we call delusions of reference.
Let's break that down for the listener. What exactly is a delusion of reference?
A delusion of reference is when the brain begins to find special, deeply personal, and highly significant meaning in completely random, unconnected everyday events.
So making connections where there are none.
Right. Our brains all have a filtering system, the sort of pattern recognition software. When you walk down the street, your brain is filtering out a million pieces of irrelevant data. A red car driving by, a bird chirping, a billboard for toothpaste.
It's just background noise.
Your filter tells you this is irrelevant to your survival, ignore it. But in a manic, psychotic state, that filter completely shuts down.
It just breaks.
Suddenly, the red car means danger. The bird is sending a code. And the billboard was put there specifically by God to give you a personal message. The brain goes into hyperdrive, connecting dots that do not exist.
I want you to imagine sitting in your living room, totally alone, and suddenly feeling with absolute undeniable certainty that the television is speaking directly to your soul.
It's a very common presentation.
Ed provides some incredibly vivid examples of this happening to him. He talks about sitting on his couch watching movies, and his phone is just rapidly filling up with pictures he was taking of the TV screen.
He felt the media was broadcasting his own life back to him.
Yes. There's one specific instance that really stood out. He was watching the movie Man of Steel, the Superman reboot.
Ah, yes. The closet scene.
Exactly. He took a series of photos of a scene where a young Clark Kent is hiding in a school closet. Clark is completely overwhelmed. He's crying, holding his hands over his ears, struggling with superhuman sensory overload.
His developing Kryptonian senses are taking in everything.
Every single sound, every heartbeat, every microscopic sight in the building, and it's agonizingly too much. Now Ed, sitting on his couch, felt a profound, deeply personal, almost holy connection to this scene.
Because of his own neurochemistry at that exact moment.
Right. Why did he feel that way? Because in his manic state, his brain was flooded with dopamine and adrenaline. He was experiencing his own literal sensory enhancement.
Colors were brighter, sounds were louder.
His thoughts were racing at light speed. His brain told him that this massive Hollywood blockbuster wasn't just a movie, it was a divine sign. It was a parallel to his exact neurological reality put there to validate his transformation.
And the terrifying power of delusions of reference is that they don't just attach to things with clear metaphorical parallels like a superhero origin story.
No, they attach to anything.
The delusion attaches to the incredibly mundane, too. Ed recounts watching a random documentary program on television, one of those shows about how everyday objects are manufactured.
Like how it's made.
Exactly. He notes that it wasn't even a show he normally watched. But suddenly, the program cuts to a segment on how brass trombones are made in a factory.
Just a completely random segment.
Now, to you or me, that's just background noise. We might change the channel. But for Ed, this was a lightning bolt.
Because he had a personal history with the trombone. Yeah.
Exactly. Ed had received a music scholarship to college playing the trombone. And he had recently, independently, started playing the instrument again.
So his brain just latched onto it.
In a manic state experiencing acute delusions of reference, the brain's logic centers are basically hijacked. The brain insists that the mathematical probability of this show airing at this exact moment is impossible.
It can't be a coincidence.
Therefore, it cannot be a coincidence. The universe, or God, or some supreme cosmic force, is placing this trombone manufacturing process on his television screen specifically for him, to send him a coded message about his destiny.
It is just wild to think about the sheer processing power the brain is using to justify these connections.
It's exhausting for the brain.
It has to be. And that leads directly into the next phase of his break, which were delusions of grandeur. Ed went from thinking the TV was sending him personalized messages to believing he was a literal prophet.
A messiah.
A messiah. Someone specifically chosen by a higher power to lead a massive, world-altering religious movement. Remember, this is an atheist patent attorney. But his hyper-religiosity became completely overwhelming.
But here's where his unique background creates a fascinating paradox. Even though he was engulfed in this profound religious delusion, his high intellect and his medical knowledge were still functioning in the background.
They didn't just turn off.
No. A part of his brain knew the psychiatric diagnostic criteria. He knew that if he walked into his kitchen and told his girlfriend, "God is communicating with me through the trombone channel, and I am the new Messiah," he would immediately face involuntary psychiatric commitment.
He knew they would lock him up.
He would be locked in a ward.
So what does a brilliant, legally trained, manic mind do to survive? It goes totally underground. He decided he had to hide his divinity from the world until the time was right.
That is the paranoia aspect stepping in to protect the grandiosity.
That's why he created those secret notebooks we talked about.
And the contents of those notebooks are a perfect, crystallized illustration of how a highly educated mind structures a delusion.
It's not just random scribbling.
Not at all. A delusion isn't always just chaotic, disorganized babble. Often, it is highly structured, incredibly complex, and completely logical if you accept the false premise it is built upon.
Which he did.
Right. Ed didn't just scribble random thoughts. He built a complex, esoteric, intellectual system. For instance, he began writing his most important divine revelations in mirror image text.
Backwards writing.
Backwards writing.
Like Leonardo da Vinci.
Exactly like Da Vinci. Ed noted in his journals that Da Vinci famously used mirror writing in his personal notebooks. Ed was experiencing paranoid delusions alongside his delusions of grandeur.
He thought people were after his ideas.
He genuinely believed he needed to protect his divine world-saving ideas from persecution, or from corporate theft, or from psychiatric intervention, much like historians speculate Da Vinci might have done to hide his scientific findings from the church.
Wow.
The delusion was so deeply integrated with his academic knowledge that he even drew a mirror image doodle of a famous Da Vinci self-portrait in the margins, purely from memory.
I am looking at the notes about how he was designing the actual iconography and logos for this new religious movement he believed he was chosen to lead. And because he is a patent attorney, a guy whose day job is obsessing over intellectual property, trademarks, and precise definitions, his divine symbols were unbelievably specific.
They weren't just standard religious symbols.
He wasn't just drawing crosses or stars. He was using the exact RGB color codes, the digital numerical color values used in computer graphics from the specific universities he had attended.
That is incredible detail.
He was meticulously incorporating ancient, strict rules of heraldry into his designs. I want you to really think about that. The brain is taking all of his highly specialized, purely secular academic knowledge and violently repurposing it as the building blocks for a religious delusion.
It's a phenomenon called bricolage.
Bricolage.
Yes. The construction or creation of a work from a diverse range of things that happen to be available. The manic brain is a master bricoleur. It takes whatever is in the room and builds a universe out of it.
That makes perfect sense.
We also see this incredible leap of associative manic logic with his sudden, intense fascination with Salvador Dali's famous painting, The Sacrament of the Last Supper.
Right, he had a print of this painting that he bought as a kid, I think on a school field trip to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C.
Correct. And in his manic state, the painting ceased to be just a piece of art. It became a map of the universe.
A literal map.
He stared at this painting, and his mind began deconstructing its geometry. Dali deliberately placed the 12 apostles and Jesus inside a massive dodecahedron.
A 12-sided geometric shape.
Yes. In ancient Platonic philosophy, the dodecahedron was the symbol used to represent the entire heavens or the cosmos.
And Ed picked up on that.
Ed, with his scientific background, immediately recognized the mathematical symbolism. He literally writes in his notes, "Hi, Pythagoras," acknowledging the ancient Greek mathematician.
Which, again, shows his intellect is fully intact. He's catching high-level art history references.
The intellect is the engine driving the delusion.
But then the disease takes the wheel.
Yes. The delusions of reference kick in and violently pull the painting into his own personal narrative. He looks past the mathematical structure, past the apostles, and focuses intensely on the background landscape of Dali's painting.
And his brain decides something unbelievable.
His brain decides, with absolute certainty, that the background looks exactly like the view of Okanagan Lake in Kelowna, British Columbia.
Which just happens to be the exact location where Ed worked as an executive for a biotechnology company.
The bricolage again.
He literally connected a masterpiece of The Last Supper, painted by a Spanish surrealist in 1955, directly to his modern-day corporate office view in Canada. He felt Dali was prophesying his specific life.
It's breathtaking how the mind does that.
And it didn't stop there. He also became entirely, agonizingly obsessed with the number 33.
Numerology is incredibly common in religious delusions. The brain fixates on numbers as pure, undeniable signals of divine order.
According to Christian tradition, Jesus was 33 years old when he was crucified and resurrected. That is the traditional timeline of a Messiah. But Ed was in his late 40s during this manic episode, and this discrepancy caused him immense psychological distress. He wrote in his journal, actively agonizing over this numerical mismatch.
He was trying to solve the puzzle.
He wrote, "What is it about 33? Why can't you be a late bloomer? It's more complicated now."
Oh, wow.
I mean, the existential dread of that is almost palpable. He is fully convinced he is the savior of humanity, but he is terrified he has missed his deadline because he aged past 33.
That is tragic.
He's trying to reconcile his own biological age with the rigid historical timeline of a Messiah, and it's tearing him apart.
If we step back from the fascinating specifics of the Da Vinci codes and the Dali paintings, and we ask why the physical brain actually does this, we have to look closely at the neurochemistry of mania.
Let's look under the hood.
Specifically, the dopamine system, which is massively dysregulated during an episode. Dopamine is not just a pleasure chemical, as it's often described.
It's not just the reward sender.
No, it is the chemical of salience. It tells the brain, this thing in front of you is incredibly important. Pay attention to it.
So when you have a flood of dopamine,
And everything becomes infinitely important. Everything is salient.
so it's an intoxicating, euphoric rush of energy and perceived clarity.
Exactly. For the person inside the episode, especially in the early stages, it does not feel like an illness. It feels like an awakening. The fog has finally lifted.
I want the listener to try and genuinely imagine the sheer awe, the overwhelming power, and perhaps the underlying creeping terror of having your brain suddenly connect every single random dot in the universe, every color, every number, every TV show, every painting, directly to your own personal destiny.
It's an unbearable amount of meaning.
The biological machinery that normally helps us find simple meaning in life, like understanding a metaphor in a poem or feeling moved by a sunset, is essentially redlining. It's a car engine pushed far past its limits until it starts shaking itself apart.
That is a terrifying and perfect analogy. It is pattern recognition without the brakes.
Which brings us to the next massive, unavoidable question in this deep dive. If the basic biology of the human brain is roughly the exact same across the entire human species, does this Messiah narrative look the same everywhere?
That's the transcultural question.
If you have a psychotic break in New York versus a psychotic break in Tokyo, do you see the same things?
No.
How much of this prophet narrative is hardwired into our DNA, and how much of it is just handed to us by the society and the culture we happen to live in?
We have to zoom out to the global scale.
Let's do it. When I was reading through the data from the Living with Schizophrenia texts, the global variations completely stopped me in my tracks.
The transcultural data is where we really see how the environment sculpts the illness.
The numbers are staggering. In the United States, about 50% of patients diagnosed with schizophrenia experience religious delusions at some point.
So half the patients.
Half. But then you look at Switzerland, and that number drops to about 21%.
A significant drop.
But then you look at Lithuania, and it spikes to a massive 64%. I mean, what is happening culturally to cause that kind of immense discrepancy in a biological illness?
It comes down to the pervasive cultural lexicon available to the patient. Schizophrenia itself, the biological fracturing of reality, occurs at roughly similar rates globally.
About 1%, right?
Yes, about 1% of the population worldwide. But the content of the delusion, what the voices actually say, who the patient believes they are, is entirely dictated by what the society values, fears, and talks about.
So the brain just uses the local material.
Exactly. If a society is highly secular and values technology, you might see more delusions involving microchips, CIA surveillance, or being trapped in the matrix.
Makes sense.
But if a society is deeply steeped in religious history, the delusions will inevitably take on a religious flavor.
And the source material shows it's not just broad national differences. It gets incredibly granular down to specific denominations.
It really does.
The Religiosity and Bipolar Disorder source cites a fascinating 2001 U.S. study showing that Protestants are actually significantly more likely to experience religious delusions than Roman Catholics living in the exact same country.
Even within the same borders, the specific theological framework changes the delusion.
And then a 2010 study from Pakistan involving highly religious Muslim patients found that they are significantly more likely to experience religious paranoia and hear commanding voices compared to less religious demographics within their own society.
The culture literally provides the vocabulary for the biological misfire.
That quote is perfect.
The illness provides the break. The culture provides the script. That is perhaps the most important concept in transcultural psychiatry.
Okay, so let's look at a very specific, deeply researched example of this cultural vocabulary in action. We have an incredibly detailed study from Makara Human Behavior Studies in Asia that focuses on the Banjar culture in South Kalimantan, Indonesia.
This is a fantastic case study.
The Banjar people have incredibly deep Islamic roots, and many within the culture engage heavily in the study of tasawwuf, which is Islamic mysticism or Sufism.
Seeking a deeply personal inner relationship with the divine.
In this culture, they are so familiar with the intersection of intense faith and mental strain that they even have a specific local cultural term for mental stress or abnormal behavior. It's called pagat lamban.
The Banjar study provides a fascinating contrast to the Western presentations of psychosis we've been discussing, like Ed Ergenzinger's.
Because it looks so different from the outside.
Because the societal values of the Banjar people are so deeply, inherently intertwined with religious devotion, the delusions do not manifest as bizarre alien concepts.
They don't look like sci-fi or Da Vinci codes.
No, they manifest through extreme, hyperbolic versions of socially recognizable, respected religious practices.
Right. They aren't drawing secret symbols. They are doing things the community already respects, just dialed up to 1,000.
Exactly. One specific case detailed in the report perfectly illustrates this. It involves a male participant who suddenly began wearing a baju koko, which is the traditional religious clothing for Muslim men in that region, every single day, all day long.
Now, wearing a baju koko is normal.
Very normal. But this wasn't just a daily fashion choice. He was using it as a rigid, unyielding, public declaration of his absolute, untouchable spiritual purity.
And his physical actions aggressively matched that declaration in ways that defied human endurance. He claimed to his family and community that he was praying all night long, every single night, without sleeping.
That level of sleep deprivation is a huge red flag.
He engaged in dhikr, which is the beautiful Islamic practice of reciting the names of God or specific prayers, usually done with prayer beads, but he was doing it for half a day at a time, claiming to perform up to 700,000 repetitions in a single sitting.
That is just physically...
If you just do the basic math on that, uttering a phrase 700,000 times, it implies a total cessation of sleep, eating, or normal human functioning.
Which feeds right back into the mania, creating a vicious cycle.
Exactly. He also genuinely believed he was being physically visited by the spirit of a highly charismatic, famous, local religious leader who had passed away, Abba Guru Sekumpul.
A revered figure in that community.
He even set up a system claiming that he could sell divine knowledge to other people in the village.
What is absolutely critical to understand here, and what makes treating these cases so extraordinarily difficult, is the community's initial reaction.
How do they react?
Well, in a highly religious, collectivistic society, These behaviors might not be immediately recognized as psychiatric symptoms at all. Fasting, extended prayer, reciting dhikr, and seeking divine knowledge are highly respected, even venerated practices.
So the community might look at him and think, wow, he is incredibly holy, rather than, wow, he needs a doctor.
Precisely. The line is incredibly blurry. It is only when the behavior crosses into absolute dysfunctional rigidity.
When it breaks down completely.
When he makes grandiose, heretical claims of being a prophet himself. Or when the sleep deprivation causes complete functional impairment, meaning he can't work, can't care for his family, that the community finally begins to see it as paglambaran, as an illness.
It has to go really far for them to intervene.
This highlights a massive ongoing challenge in transcultural psychiatry. How does a doctor separate deep, genuine cultural faith from a psychotic delusion without insulting the patient?
Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly really tense. So if culture is providing the script, that puts a modern, Western-trained doctor in a really difficult, almost impossible position, right?
It creates a lot of friction.
How does a secular psychiatrist treat someone wearing a baju koko and performing 700,000 prayers without insulting their entire belief system? We have a philosophical and medical concept from the BJ Psych Bulletin that is vital to understanding this friction. It's called epistemic injustice.
Epistemic injustice is a brilliant philosophical concept originally introduced by Miranda Fricker, and it has become highly applicable to modern psychiatry.
Let's define it.
Broadly, it occurs when a person is given less credibility, less respect, as a knower of their own life, simply because of who they are or the bizarre nature of their experience.
They are just dismissed.
Yes. In the specific context of religious delusions, this injustice breaks down into two distinct types that we see in clinics every day. First, there is testimonial injustice.
Let's define that for the listener.
Testimonial injustice is when a doctor or mental health professional simply does not believe the patient's testimony about their own internal life.
The doctor just writes them off.
The doctor hears a patient say, "God spoke to me and told me to do this," and because the doctor operates in a secular scientific framework, they immediately discount the patient's entire narrative.
They just see a symptom.
They view it purely as a symptom to be medicated away, rather than a profound, terrifying personal experience that the patient is actually living through.
Yeah.
They treat the patient as an unreliable witness to their own mind.
Right. And the second type is contributory injustice. This happens when the dominant group, let's say a hospital board of Western-trained psychiatrists, lacks the conceptual resources, the vocabulary, or the cultural knowledge to even begin to understand the marginalized group's experience.
They don't even have the tools to comprehend it.
The BJ Psych paper gives a couple of really powerful hypothetical scenarios to illustrate exactly how this plays out in real life. Imagine a 50-year-old female teacher from the UK.
Okay.
She and her husband had a profound, genuine Christian conversion experience. They traveled across Africa to evangelize, did missionary work, and now she's back home in the UK teaching. Suddenly, she starts experiencing auditory hallucinations. Voices talking about the end of the world. Because of her background, she believes these voices are divine, and she believes she is a newly minted prophet. A local priest from her charismatic church even supports this interpretation.
He validates it.
She loves her spiritual gifts. She feels chosen. But her colleagues at her school are utterly terrified and call for a psychiatric evaluation because she has started teaching biblical prophecy in the middle of her math classes.
Now, put yourself in the shoes of the psychiatrist assigned to evaluate her. If that doctor sits down in a sterile room, looks at this woman who feels touched by God, and bluntly says, "You have schizophrenia. Those voices are just a chemical imbalance in your auditory cortex. Here is an antipsychotic pill," that doctor is committing profound epistemic injustice.
They are stripping away her whole worldview.
By immediately reducing her entire life's mission, her deeply held faith, and her missionary work to a mere hallucination, the doctor ensures that the patient will never, ever trust them.
But wait, let me push back on that for a second. From a purely medical standpoint, the doctor is technically right, aren't they? It is a chemical imbalance. Isn't a doctor's job to cut through the delusion and treat the disease?
It is their job to treat the disease, yes.
Yeah.
But you cannot treat a disease if the patient refuses to take the medicine.
Ah, compliance.
Exactly. And a patient will refuse the medicine if they feel you are actively attacking their soul. The medical truth does not negate the patient's emotional truth. You have to bridge the two.
That makes sense. You have to meet them where they are. The paper gives another scenario that is equally intense, maybe even more so, regarding the danger of this disconnect.
The case with a young man.
Imagine a 20-year-old Muslim man who is absolutely terrified. He is completely withdrawn, hiding in his darkened bedroom, not eating. Why? Because he is battling vicious auditory voices that are commanding him to kill his own father.
Horrifying.
He knows it's wrong. He loves his father. He's agonizingly trying to resist the commands. He finally breaks down and tells his family and his local imam what is happening. Because of his cultural framework, he explains that he believes these violent voices are jinns.
Right, which are supernatural, invisible creatures in Islamic theology known to possess or influence humans.
His family, operating entirely within that religious framework, tells him that he just isn't praying hard enough and they need to perform a spiritual cleansing.
In that specific scenario, the young man is experiencing epistemic injustice from his own community.
They aren't seeing the medical side.
They're viewing his severe medical crisis purely as a spiritual failing or a lack of piety. He is sick, and they're telling him to pray the sickness away. But if a hospital psychiatrist then steps in, forcibly admits him, and completely ignores his deeply held belief in jinns, telling him it's just a misfiring temporal lobe and his religion has nothing to do with it, the doctor commits epistemic injustice from the other direction.
So he's trapped between a community that denies his medical reality and a doctor who denies his spiritual reality.
Exactly. He has no allies. And the clinical recommendation, the only way out of that trap, is that a doctor must validate the emotional reality of the experience, even if they don't validate the literal delusion.
How do they do that?
They must create a safe space where the patient feels heard. The doctor can say, I understand you believe these are jinns, and I can see how utterly terrifying that must be for you. Let's work together to quiet these voices.
That is such a better approach.
Bluntly saying it's just a hallucination alienates the patient and practically guarantees non-compliance with any medical treatment once they leave the hospital.
I need to take a breath here, and I want to issue a warning to you listening right now. We have talked about the euphoria of mania, the fascinating cultural shaping of delusions, and the difficulty of communicating across the medical-spiritual divide. But this deep dive is about to go into some incredibly dark, distressing territory.
It is very heavy from here.
Because while the brain's search for meaning can start out euphoric, when the biology truly turns against the body, the results can be devastating. We are talking about the brain entirely overriding the body's most basic, primal self-preservation instincts.
That is the grim, tragic reality of severe psychosis. The delusions do not always cast the patient as a blessed euphoric prophet.
They can get very dark.
Frequently, as the neurochemistry shifts, the delusions violently turn inward. They begin to revolve around profound, crushing religious guilt, the absolute terror of demonic possession, and the immediate threat of divine punishment.
We have a harrowing case report from the journal European Psychiatry titled God's Ultimatum. This details a 27-year-old male patient who came from a very strong, devout, evangelical Christian background.
A sudden onset.
Yes, he experienced a sudden, acute onset of manic and psychotic symptoms, and within a very short time frame, he developed a terrifying belief that God has handed him a literal, non-negotiable life-or-death ultimatum.
A test of faith.
The voices told him, with absolute divine authority, that he had to fast, meaning he could eat absolutely nothing for 28 days straight. And if he failed, if he took a single bite of food, God was going to violently kill his mother.
The pressure of that is unimaginable.
He was so deeply entrenched in this that he began interpreting completely mundane, everyday objects like the random numbers and letters on license plates of passing cars as coded, divine messages confirming this horrifying threat.
This case is a prime textbook example of delusional guilt driving life-threatening behavior. Look at the mechanics of what is happening. His response to this ultimatum was complete, unwavering, self-imposed starvation.
He stopped eating entirely.
But we have to understand his internal motivation. He wasn't depressed. He wasn't trying to commit suicide. He didn't want to die.
He was trying to save her.
In his deeply fractured mind, he was engaging in a heroic, necessary, and completely logical act of self-sacrifice to save his mother's life. The religious context, the biblical concept of fasting, sacrifice, and divine wrath, provided the framework for the delusion.
But the biology gave it power.
But the biological illness provided the absolute, unshakable conviction that nearly starved him to death before his body finally collapsed and he was admitted to a secure psychiatric unit.
It is the sheer cruelty of the disease. He is torturing himself out of love for his mother. But the physical danger can manifest much more suddenly and much more violently than starvation.
It can.
And this brings us to a paper from the Industrial Psychiatry Journal on a phenomenon that is so extreme, it's honestly hard for a healthy brain to even process. We are talking about male genital self-mutilation, or GSM. In the psychiatric literature, there is a proposed specific name for this horrific act when it is directly tied to religious delusions. It's called Klingsor syndrome.
Yes, the name Klingsor syndrome is derived from a character in Richard Wagner's famous 19th century opera, Parsifal.
What's the story there?
In the story of the opera, the magician Klingsor desperately wants to join a holy, chaste religious brotherhood known as the Knights of the Grail. But he's a flawed human. He cannot control his sexual urges and remain pure.
So he takes drastic measures.
So in an act of absolute desperate devotion, he casts a spell and castrates himself to forcefully guarantee his own purity and eligibility for the Holy Order.
And they named the syndrome after him.
In modern psychiatric literature, this dramatic eponym is used to categorize male patients who intentionally mutilate their own genitalia, specifically due to psychotic religious delusions centered around overwhelming guilt, the need for atonement, or the belief that they have committed an unforgivable sexual sin.
The case studies provided in the journal are incredibly difficult to hear, but they are absolutely crucial for understanding the sheer, terrifying power of a delusion. Case 1 involves a 38-year-old man. He started experiencing severe paranoia, believing the people in his town were mocking him, calling him a half-man. Then the auditory hallucinations started. He began hearing command hallucinations, authoritative voices telling him that there was a massive, lethal conspiracy to harm his family.
The stakes are always life and death.
Always. The voices convinced him that the only possible way to save his family, the only sacrifice that would appease his persecutors and God, was to cut off his own penis.
And he believed it.
He believed this with the same certainty that you and I believe the sky is blue. He calmly went into his bathroom, locked the door, and used the standard shaving blade to slice off his penis at the base.
And medically, from a neurological standpoint, the most astonishing and terrifying part of that clinical report is not just the act itself, but his physical reaction during and after the amputation.
Right.
The examining emergency doctors noted that he exhibited no shock. And more importantly, he reported feeling no physical pain whatsoever.
None.
When he looked down and saw the catastrophic bleeding, he didn't panic. He didn't scream. Instead, he reported feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace and relief.
How is that physically possible? How does a human being sever a major body part and not feel pain?
Because the brain is the ultimate arbiter of pain. Pain is a signal sent to the brain, but the brain can choose to block it if it believes something else is more critical.
It just shuts off the receptors.
In this man's case, his brain was so incredibly deeply entrenched in the psychotic narrative, the absolute belief that his family was about to be murdered, that the physical pain signals from his nerve endings were entirely overridden by the psychological and spiritual relief of having successfully saved his family through his bloody sacrifice.
Wow.
The delusion created a massive surge of endorphins and adrenaline that acted as a localized anesthetic.
It just shows that the reality constructed by the brain is absolute. Case 2 from that same journal shows how entirely different medical triggers can lead to the exact same horrific outcome.
Yes, the alcohol withdrawal case.
This was a 42-year-old man, but his psychosis wasn't caused by schizophrenia. He was suffering from severe alcohol withdrawal delirium, commonly known as delirium tremens or DTs.
Very dangerous condition.
Extremely. He had been drinking massive, lethal amounts of alcohol, between 180 to 240 milliliters of hard rum every single day, and he stopped abruptly. His brain chemistry went into absolute chaos.
His brain was starved for the depressant.
He went into delirium tremens, experiencing terrifying, vivid, auditory, and visual hallucinations of demonic persecutors coming into his room to torture him and mutilate his genitalia. In his state of severe, sweaty confusion and primal terror, he decided he wouldn't let the demons have the satisfaction of doing it to him. So he preemptively mutilated his own scrotum, testes, and penis with the blade.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of human psychology, we have to ask why the psychotic brain specifically targets this highly sensitive part of the body.
It's a very specific fixation.
The psychiatric analysis suggests it is almost always deeply tied to delusional guilt, deep-seated, unresolved sexual conflicts, and a psychotic perception of atonement.
Trying to balance the scales.
In the fractured mind of the patient, the act of mutilation is not an act of random, senseless violence. It is perceived as a perfectly logical, mathematically sound, and absolutely necessary psychotic solution to a terrifying spiritual or physical threat. It is the ultimate extreme physical manifestation of what psychologists refer to as negative religious coping.
Let's let's define that concept because it's central to everything we're discussing. Positive religious coping is what we normally see in society.
It's healthy.
It's when a person uses their faith as a tool for resilience. They use it to find forgiveness, to lean on their church community for support, and to find a sense of peaceful, divine meaning in their earthly suffering.
Right.
Negative religious coping, on the other hand, is when the mind violently turns faith against itself. It's when a person uses their religion to terrorize their own psyche, believing an illness is a direct, targeted punishment from an angry God, or that literal demons are physically causing their suffering.
The Punisher model.
And historically, we've seen how this negative religious coping, when combined with untreated psychosis, can end in historic tragedy. The Living with Schizophrenia text brings up the famous, incredibly sad 19th century case of the English artist Richard Dadd.
Richard Dadd is a fascinating, deeply tragic figure in both the history of psychiatry and the history of fine art. In 1843, at the relatively young age of 26, he developed severe, sudden-onset religious delusions during a trip to Egypt.
The suddenness is striking.
He became entirely, unshakably convinced that his own loving father was actually the devil in disguise, and that the Egyptian god Osiris had personally called upon him to act as a holy warrior to do battle with the forces of evil.
A divine mission.
Acting on this absolute terrifying delusion, he returned to England and murdered his father.
He was caught, obviously, and he spent the remainder of his entire life, decades, confined in the infamous Bethlehem and Broadmoor psychiatric asylums. But here's the part that twists your brain. His immense artistic talent didn't vanish when he lost his sanity.
The technical skill remained.
While locked in a cell in the asylum, still actively experiencing auditory voices and delusions, he painted his absolute masterpiece, the Fairy Feller's Masterstroke, which is a brilliantly complex, intricately detailed painting that currently hangs in the prestigious Tate Gallery in London today.
It is a stunning piece of art.
It's a profound, undeniable testament to the fact that immense, structured, brilliant creativity and severe destructive psychosis can occupy the exact same human brain at the exact same time.
So, we have established the internal architecture of a delusion. We've looked at the cultural variations, and we've explored the extreme, sometimes fatal dangers. But this leads us to the most critical, foundational question of causality.
Where does it come from?
What actually sparks the break in the first place? Is the religion itself the trigger? Can studying intense theology or attending a highly emotional religious event actually cause a perfectly healthy person to go crazy?
That is exactly the question that researchers wanted to answer when they looked back at a massive historical event, the Welsh religious revival of 1904 to 1905. We have a fascinating epidemiological study here from Cambridge Core, published in the journal Psychological Medicine.
This is a great data set.
The Welsh revival was a massive, highly emotional, nationwide spiritual awakening. Hundreds of thousands of people across Wales were attending these fervent, intense, emotionally charged revival meetings in chapels and fields. Researchers went deep into the historical admission records of the North Wales Hospital to see if this massive, collective cultural event had any measurable impact on the mental health of the population.
And the data they uncovered is highly revealing about how the brain handles collective stress. They found a statistically massive, undeniable spike in what is clinically known as brief polymorphic psychoses, or BPP.
What does that mean exactly?
These are acute, highly chaotic, transient psychotic episodes. And the hospital admission records from that year directly explicitly linked many of these sudden admissions to the patient's attendance at the revival meetings.
The meetings themselves triggered it.
The intense emotional atmosphere, the fervent fire and brimstone preaching, the weeping, the collective hysteria of the crowd, it acted as a direct, overwhelming psychological trigger that temporarily fractured reality for neurologically vulnerable individuals.
And this is a huge, very important, but for the listener to understand, the researchers noted a very specific long-term outcome. While the revival undeniably triggered these transient psychotic episodes, these specific patients rarely went on to develop chronic, lifelong degenerative mental illnesses like schizophrenia.
They bounce back.
Once they were physically removed from the intense, highly charged environment of the chapel and placed in the quiet of the hospital, the psychosis usually faded away naturally.
Which aligns perfectly with a very well-documented, highly unusual modern phenomenon known as the Jerusalem syndrome.
I've heard of this.
Psychiatrists working in hospitals in Israel frequently treat tourists, and this spans across various faiths. It affects Jewish, Christian, and Muslim travelers who arrive in the holy city of Jerusalem.
Just regular tourists.
These are often people with no prior psychiatric history. but they are so profoundly overwhelmed by the historical, religious, and spiritual gravity of the environment that their brains essentially short-circuit, and they experience a sudden, intense religious psychosis.
Right. They might start draping themselves in the white bed sheets from their hotel, marching down to the Western Wall or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, preaching at the top of their lungs on street corners, or genuinely claiming to be resurrected biblical figures like John the Baptist.
Yes. But the fascinating clinical reality of Jerusalem syndrome is that usually, a few weeks after they are medicated, put on a plane, flown home, and physically removed from the geographic trigger environment, the psychosis clears up completely.
The trigger is gone.
They return to their normal lives, often highly embarrassed by what happened.
So an intense environment can definitely trigger a temporary localized break. But what about the chronic, long-term, devastating religious delusions we see in schizophrenia? Let's tie this all back to the Banjar culture study in Indonesia that we talked about earlier.
The Tasawwuf study.
The researchers in that study made it very, very clear that simply studying Tasawwuf or Islamic mysticism was not the root cause of the schizophrenia in those villages.
Exactly. The researchers explicitly point out the religious study was merely the context. It was not the cause. The actual root causes of the severe psychosis were deeply biological and deeply psychological.
So what was the cause?
They highlight the undeniable roles of genetic predisposition, combined with severe childhood trauma or profound interpersonal loss. They detail the tragic history of one of their subjects, participant R.
Right, the trauma history.
His severe psychiatric symptoms didn't just appear out of nowhere one afternoon because he read a holy book too closely. His symptoms severely worsened, moving from mild oddities to full-blown psychosis after profound, destabilizing trauma. His mother died unexpectedly, and his father quickly remarried without consulting the children, essentially abandoning him emotionally.
The emotional devastation of that sudden loss fractured something fundamental in his psyche. The text notes he started hearing whispers as a child shortly after that trauma. As he grew older, the trauma festered, his underlying genetic predisposition for schizophrenia activated, and his biological brain desperately needed a way to explain the terrifying whispers he was hearing.
The brain needs a story.
So, what does this all mean? It means the brain acts as a scavenger. It uses the existing cultural frameworks around it, whether that's a 19th century Welsh revival, the deep study of Islamic mysticism, or, in the case of our patent attorney, Ed Ergenzinger, the laws of intellectual property and Da Vinci paintings to construct a narrative around a biological or trauma-induced fracture.
It builds a raft out of the debris.
The biological illness provides the break in reality. The surrounding culture provides the script the patient reads from.
Which brings us inevitably to the cold clinical reality. If the biological illness provides the break, how do we actually fix it? We have to look at the medical and spiritual path forward.
The treatment side.
Treatment for these conditions is incredibly uniquely complex because you aren't just battling neurochemistry. You are actively battling the patient's absolute, unshakable belief that they do not need a doctor.
Because in their mind, why would you take a pill to stop speaking to God?
Exactly. Let's revisit Ed Ergenzinger, our brilliant neuroscientist. He wrote that for a very long time, he violently resisted any form of psychiatric treatment.
Which makes sense, given the highs.
Because the energy, the perceived clarity, and the euphoria of his manic episodes were deeply intoxicating. He felt like a superhuman. But eventually, the biology takes its toll. The sheer inability to sleep for days on end physically broke his body down.
He crashed.
In a moment of clarity, he finally listened to the desperate pleas of his family and his girlfriend, and he agreed to take a powerful antipsychotic medication called olanzapine, commonly sold under the brand name Zyprexa.
And the clinical outcome for Ed really highlights the tragic double-edged sword of modern psychiatric medication. On one hand, he responded to the olanzapine very quickly and successfully. The drug functioned as an emergency brake on his dopamine system.
It stopped the mania.
It finally helped him sleep, it tamped down the racing, grandiose plans of starting a new religion, and his supersenses and hyper-religiosity rapidly subsided. The medication successfully chemically stabilized his neurochemistry. He was no longer psychotic.
The medicine worked.
However, the physical side effects of that stabilization were brutal.
They often are.
The article notes he gained 20 pounds in a single month, and he suffered from severe, constant muscle soreness. 20 pounds in 30 days is a catastrophic metabolic shock to the body. Ed points out in his writing that this precise experience is exactly why patient noncompliance is so incredibly high in psychiatric care.
It's a huge barrier.
Imagine waking up from a state where you felt like a glowing, divine being with superhuman senses, communicating with the cosmos. And now, thanks to this pill, the voices are gone, but you feel sluggish, you're in constant physical pain, your clothes don't fit, and you've rapidly gained weight. The world goes from technicolor back to gray. It takes immense, heroic willpower to wake up every morning and willingly swallow that pill.
It does. But Ed also uses his platform to highlight the incredible hope in modern pharmacological medicine. He didn't just abandon his treatment when it got hard. He used his scientific literacy to advocate for himself. He worked closely with his doctors to find different antipsychotics with fewer metabolic side effects. He even mentions new cutting-edge therapeutics currently on the horizon.
Right. He mentions combining olanzapine with let me make sure I read this right, a novel mu-opioid receptor antagonist. Okay, please translate that into plain English for me and the listener. What does an opioid receptor have to do with antipsychotics and weight gain?
It's a fascinating pharmacological workaround. The antipsychotic olanzapine is great at stopping delusions, but it massively disrupts the brain's metabolic and reward pathways, which causes patients to binge eat and gain weight rapidly.
So they just crave food constantly.
Researchers discovered that by adding a specific drug that blocks the mu-opioid receptors, which are part of the brain's reward system, they can essentially blunt the intense cravings and metabolic dysfunction.
That is brilliant.
So the patient gets the sanity-saving benefits of the antipsychotic without the massive demoralizing weight gain caused by the reward center misfiring.
That is incredible. We saw a similarly positive, though initially terrifying, outcome in the case of the 27-year-old with God's ultimatum who was starving himself to save his mother. In the hospital, once he was safely admitted, doctors initiated an aggressive pharmacological treatment plan.
They had to act fast.
They used an antipsychotic called paliperidone, which they titrated up to 9 milligrams a day, alongside a mood stabilizer called sodium valproate, titrated to 1,000 milligrams a day. Just so we are absolutely clear, when the journal says titrated up, that just means they slowly, systematically introduced increasing doses of the medication to his system over time so his body wouldn't go into toxic shock.
Exactly. You start low and go slow, carefully monitoring how the brain's chemistry reacts to the blockade of dopamine receptors. And in his case, the timeline of his recovery is really encouraging for clinicians. After just 2 weeks of that highly specific, carefully titrated medication regimen, his severe symptoms showed significant, measurable improvement.
He started coming down.
The absolute intensity of the religious delusion decreased. He stopped talking about his mother dying quite as much, and his manic symptoms, like his extreme hyperactivity and his rapid, pressured speech, noticeably diminished.
And the outcome by the end of the month is the real victory. By the end of the 4th week in the hospital, the psychotic thinking was entirely gone. He actually gained what psychiatrists call insight, meaning he recognized the irrational, disease-driven nature of his previous beliefs about the license plates and the ultimatum.
The delusion broke.
Most importantly, he started eating normally again, and the immediate risk of fatal self-harm was completely eliminated.
But seeing these recoveries raises a very important question, one that researchers have spent a lot of time and money debating over the last few decades. Does having a specifically religious delusion mean you have a worse overall prognosis than someone with a secular, non-religious delusion?
That is a great question.
For a very long time in the 20th century, there was an underlying assumption in the psychiatric field that religious delusions were inherently harder to treat, more deeply entrenched, and indicated a much more severe, untreatable form of schizophrenia.
But the hard data tells a much more nuanced, surprising story. When I was going through the stack of sources, I found a massive epidemiological study published by the Hellenic Psychiatric Association that looked at a massive sample size in Germany.
The data on this is really solid.
They tracked 929 distinct patients who were all diagnosed with delusional schizophrenia between the years 2010 and 2014. Out of that huge group, exactly 15% experienced specifically religious delusions.
And when the statisticians actually crunched the numbers and compared the two groups, the statistical differences were highly surprising to the old-school psychiatrists. They found absolutely no difference in the total duration of hospitalization or the total number of lifetime hospitalizations between the patients suffering from religious delusions and those suffering from other secular types of delusions like government paranoia.
It was the same.
The disease progressed at the exact same clinical rate.
They did find a slight statistical trend indicating a slightly worse short-term outcome immediately after a break. The study noted that patients with religious delusions had slightly lower Global Assessment of Functioning, or GAF scores, upon their initial discharge from the hospital. Real quick, what exactly is a GAF score measuring in a patient's real life?
The Global Assessment of Functioning, or GAF, is a numeric scale from 0 to 100 used by mental health clinicians to subjectively rate the social, occupational, and psychological functioning of an individual.
Like grading their daily life.
A high score means you are going to work, maintaining relationships, and managing life well. A very low score means you are a danger to yourself or completely unable to care for your basic hygiene or nutritional needs.
Okay, so their GAF scores were slightly lower on discharge, and as other studies, like the one by Moore, have pointed out, they are sometimes slightly less likely to maintain their long-term medication treatment plans, probably due to that epistemic injustice we discussed earlier. If they feel their faith was attacked, they drop the pills.
But long-term, over the course of a lifetime, the outcomes are often remarkably similar. In fact, the Hellenic study notes a fascinating psychological trade-off. While patients with religious delusions might score higher on what we call positive symptoms, which are the actively intrusive symptoms like hallucinations, hearing voices, and holding firm delusions, they often actually have much lower rates of negative symptoms.
Negative symptoms being what exactly?
Negative symptoms in schizophrenia are often the most devastating long-term aspects of the illness. They include things like severe apathy, a complete lack of emotional expression, which we call flat affect, severe social withdrawal, and the inability to feel pleasure.
Just a total draining of life.
The data suggests that the intense passion, the deep fervor, and the community involvement often associated with a religious delusion might actually neurologically protect the patient against the severe emotional blunting and apathy that so often accompanies chronic lifelong schizophrenia.
It keeps them going.
The delusion keeps them emotionally engaged with the world, even if that engagement is based on a false premise.
That is an unbelievable paradox. The very thing making them sick is also keeping their emotions alive. So, to summarize the clinical side, the antipsychotic medicine can fix the dopamine chemistry. But, as we learned with the concept of epistemic injustice, the medicine absolutely cannot heal the loss of meaning.
The psychological void.
If a patient genuinely deeply believes they have spoken face-to-face with God, a pill doesn't just erase the profound emotional memory of that experience, it leaves a massive, gaping psychological void. This is precisely why both the BJ Psych and the Living with Schizophrenia texts absolutely hammer home the vital, non-negotiable necessity of integrated care.
It is a fundamental, unavoidable reality of global healthcare that a deeply religious patient, whether they are in rural America or Indonesia, is far more likely to go to their local priest, their pastor, or their imam for help long before they ever set foot in a sterile psychiatrist's office.
It's just human nature to go to your community first.
Therefore, the strongest recommendation across all the literature is that clinical psychiatrists must put aside their egos and actively collaborate with hospital chaplains and local faith leaders.
It has to be a team effort. Think about the trauma of recovery. When a patient finally comes out of the psychotic haze, when the medication kicks in and the voices finally stop, they are left standing in the absolute wreckage of their faith.
They've lost their divine mission.
They believed they were a prophet, and now they're being told they're just sick. They desperately need theological, spiritual support to safely restructure their beliefs. The psychiatrist handles the dopamine receptors, they prescribe the olanzapine, but the chaplain is the one who sits down and helps the patient figure out what their relationship with the divine actually looks like now that the burning bush has stopped talking to them.
Exactly. It's about helping the patient safely transition from that destructive, terrifying, negative religious coping where God is punishing them back to a healthy, supportive, positive religious coping.
Guiding them back to safety.
It is about validating their core spiritual identity while simultaneously managing their chronic medical reality. You cannot treat the brain and ignore the soul, regardless of whether you believe in a soul or not.
Wow. Okay, let's take a step back and bring this all together. Think back to where we started this journey an hour ago. We asked you to imagine the fine, blurry line between a profound, historical, spiritual awakening and a terrifying medical emergency. What we've seen today, walking through these cases, is the incredible, awe-inspiring, and sometimes deeply terrifying power of the human brain to seek out patterns and demand meaning from the void.
The lengths the brain will go to.
From Ed Ergensinger furiously drawing Da Vinci's mirror, writing in a secret notebook to decode the universe, to the tragic, violent story of Richard Dad painting immortal masterpieces while locked in an asylum cell, our minds are fundamentally biologically desperate to understand our place in the cosmos. We are, at our core, meaning-making machines.
And we can't turn that off.
And sometimes, whether due to the trauma of losing a parent, the genetic lottery, or a neurochemical storm of dopamine, that mechanism goes into severe overdrive, frantically latching onto whatever cultural script happens to be lying around.
And exploring that exact mechanism leads me to a final thought for you to ponder long after we finish today. We've spent the last hour looking backward and looking at the present. We've seen how the fragile human brain latches on to the dominant cultural and religious symbols of its specific time, whether that's the overwhelming emotional fervor of a 19th century Welsh chapel revival, the deeply held ancient cultural belief in supernatural jinns, or the modern interpretation of random car license plates as terrifying biblical ultimatums.
The brain simply uses the tools it is handed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I want you to look at the rapid trajectory of our modern society. We are becoming increasingly rapidly secular, and our daily waking reality is becoming deeply, inextricably intertwined with digital technology and the internet. But the biological hardware inside our skulls, that desperate, hardwired, evolutionary need for supreme meaning, for a higher power, and for pattern recognition that hasn't vanished,
Yeah, it's still there.
hasn't evolved away. So what happens next? Will the severe religious delusions of the near future look entirely different? Will patients in psychiatric wards no longer believe they are talking to ancient angels, but instead believe they're communicating with rogue artificial intelligences?
That's entirely possible.
Will they believe they are trapped in simulated realities, receiving algorithmic, digital prophecies downloaded directly from the cloud? If the human brain is, as we've said, fundamentally a meaning-making machine that demands a higher power to make sense of the chaos, what exactly will it choose to worship when the old gods are finally replaced by code?
Now, that is a thought that will absolutely keep you staring at the ceiling tonight. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly intense deep dive into the source material. We genuinely hope it gave you a completely new lens through which to view the incredible, fragile complexities of the human mind. Keep questioning the world around you, keep exploring the unknown, have empathy for those navigating the dark, and most importantly, stay endlessly curious. Catch you next time.